One of the arguments we keep hearing about Audemars Piguet Code 1159 is that the overall cold response it received was a direct reflection of the very same behavior that was seen back in the 70s after the release of Royal Oak, a design sketched by Genta to showcase a watch case that was integrated into the bracelet. Interestingly, despite being a bold and statement move by AP back in the 70s, it actually wasn't accepted and welcomed by a large pool of buyers and the market initially, and AP struggled to sell their first 1,000 Royal Oaks. And it took more than a year for AP to sell all of them. The same Royal Oaks that are now called in the collector's world as A series and are the most sought after Royal Oaks to be had. While the Royal Oak did eventually become a massive success in a relatively shorter time frame and continues to be the leader in the watchmaking, the similar cold response that the AP Code 1159 received also triggered a similar sentiment and debate as to whether are we seeing the history repeating itself with another icon in horology in the making. So let's dive deeper into this debate and look closely at how things are trending and why the AP code may or may not be a watch with similar caliber as the Royal Oak. While aesthetics are subjective, and we will still touch on many different elements of aesthetics that may or may not be favoring the code and its design, let's get to the aesthetics later in the video and look at some other stats that may enlighten us to support the analysis and come to a conclusion as to whether should we lay similar expectations from Code 1159 or are we possibly deluding ourselves into believing what otherwise may be a fool's paradise. The Royal Oak was introduced by AP in 1972, and while its first year was challenging, it changed their mentality and created its impression in the first couple of years. Yes, it wasn't welcomed widely in the first year, but the impact it left in the first 3 to 4 years was so large and substantial that some of the biggest and oldest watch manufacturers were forced to think about coming up with something similar that could compete with Royal Oak. It was in fact only 4 years after the Royal Oak was released that Patek came with their own version of integrated bracelet watch, the Nautilus. This was the impact of Royal Oak, that the watch manufacturers that didn't even ever made watches made of steel or sports watches in general had to rethink and resort to the idea of integrated bracelet watches and embrace the new watch dimension as introduced by AP. This does not stop here, and Vacheron came up with their own version of the watch, the 222, another integrated bracelet watch that could compete with the Royal Oak and contribute in the changing times with large acceptance of market towards the new watch concept. Let's also not forget that these two watches by Patek and VC were introduced in just under 4 years after the original release of Royal Oak. Girard-Perregaux were even more proactive, and they introduced their own version of the watch in the form of Laureato only after 3 years of Royal Oak. These 4 brands are some of the oldest watch manufacturers to exist in the world, and the impact of Royal Oak was so significant that all the 3 competitors had responded within the first 4 years. Now let's compare the similar with Code 1159, and while we are into the 4th year now, let aside others following the idea, even AP seemed to be still struggling with selling them and keep coming up with new dials, new colors, new straps and whatnot so that they can sell them. In fact, the Code 1159 possibly also still gives other watch manufacturers the inspiration, but this time it's not about what to do, rather it's about what not to do to make it a success. So is Patek, Vacheron and even GP also making another watch to pay homage to Code 1159 too? You wish, AP. As I briefly touched on the aesthetics, they are all subjective, and while I'm sure that there are buyers out there that adore and admire these watches, I personally can't sugarcoat it and will share what I personally think, but will also back my comments with some basis and reasoning. And the good news is that it's not all negative, rather there are many positives too. But again, there's probably a lesson for other watch manufacturers for what not to do to make it work. When you look at code up close on a component level, it actually comes across as a really nice piece. Notice, you need to stick to component level strictly in isolation. And if you forget about the watch for now and talk strictly about component design, the hour markers and the dial hands are actually very elegant and offer a fine craftsmanship. Similar is the case with the dial, and there's some of the best brush lines to be seen on the dial. Talking about the crystal, it is amazing and shows multiple layers when you see it sideways, giving out an optical illusion where you feel like the crystal is convexing out. But when you see it from the top view, it is flat. This adds to the overall experience and joy. The case is hexagonal and complex, but since the dial and the bezel is round, you can't see it unless you see it from the side. The movement is flyback chrono and fully in-house, which is the first time AP had the ability to offer in any watch. So the code did come with technical innovation and mastery by AP as a brand. The hollowed lugs are another design aspect that's executed very well. But when you put all the components together, the biggest issue is that they don't marry with each other. And as such, there's some core design and aesthetic issues that leave it as a rather awkward looking watch. The sleek and dressy hands, while beautiful, are not suitable for rather casual and big watch. The font on the dial, especially for the chronos, gives the watch a rather cheap look and makes it look like a fashion watch. The dial is busy, crowded and unnecessarily complicated. The size is big, the case is thick, the crown is not screwed in. The subdials are probably a touch too big. The hands are too slim for otherwise a chunky watch. Since it is a chrono watch, so you'd expect it to be sporty, which it is. But then the hour markers suggest otherwise. So in my opinion, there's some fundamental flaws in the design department which leave this watch overall just an off-looking watch. The code 1159 doesn't seem to be a success as yet, and let aside other brands follow this design, AP themselves still seem to be struggling to sell them. If you go into your AD for a Royal Oak and all they have is a code to show you or offer you for sale, then you know what is fundamentally wrong with the business model and how these watches are being sold. You want to buy a Royal Oak, but the boutique wants to sell you a code. You want to buy because you can't buy, and they want to sell because they can't sell. So I don't necessarily blame them. But the next time you are told that the code 1159 is the next icon in the making and that the history is repeating like the Royal Oak, make sure that you are not falling into that trap.